Good evening, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this evening's edition of Reporter's Notebook. Today is Tuesday, and that means Emily and I recorded another episode of What the Politics. Hey, Emily, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I know that we both had an extremely long day, but today's podcast was quite interesting, and I think it also wrapped up with another story that you were doing for today. Or not wrapped up, but it was along the kind of like the same lines.
Yeah.
If you want to kind of first talk about the story that you did for today, and then we'll get into the podcast.
Sure. So the story I covered today was about Senate Bill 331. There's also a House bill in conjunction, a few House bills in conjunction with that. But basically what Senate Bill 331 is all about is public school nurses. There's kind of a ratio, a national ratio that the federal government has put out that there should kind of be about one school nurse per every 750 students. However, here in North Carolina, the average is more like one school nurse per every 1,000 students. And in certain counties, specifically Wake County, it's one school nurse to every almost 1,400 students. And a lot of the time in these North Carolina public schools, what we're seeing is, they may have a school nurse, but that school nurse isn't a full-time nurse at that school. That school nurse also works at, 2 to 3 other different public schools. So they're more of an on-call nurse, and there's not a lot of people, not a lot of nurses full-time directly, permanently in the schools, ready to help students at that moment. So this House bill is really just pushing for funding for North Carolina schools to be able to put permanent school nurses in every single public school.
So we're talking here a little bit about, well, really within the past year, how important school nurses have been, not only for just the everyday tummy aches and when it comes to, when a kid, wants to go home early and might say something that can take them home early, whether it's a headache or something like that. Not saying that I ever did that when I was a kid. I'm just saying that is definitely a possibility. But besides, the taking care of the kids, really when they are sick, but also playing an important role as schools are kind of heading back to a sense of normalcy now that a lot of people are getting vaccinated. And I'm not sure what the latest statistics are, not statistics, but what the latest guidance is for kids getting vaccinated. But I mean, they just play an important role in trying to get things back to normal as fast as they can.
Definitely. So, and just one more note I do want to make about that story that I found so interesting. I got to speak with the co-author of that bill, which was Democratic North Carolina Senator Wiley Nickel. He is awesome. And he was kind of explaining to me that at a lot of North Carolina schools, if you were to go in, a lot of these places that don't have permanent school nurses, you go in and a child doesn't feel well, a child feels sick or is having symptoms, and it's basically a front desk lady opening a book and kind of going down the list of, a student is having these symptoms, what to do, who should I call, kind of thing. And there's not really, a trained nurse or a trained medical professional there doing it. It's kind of a, in this situation, what can I do? So I thought that was really interesting. I never thought about it from that perspective, or that was, even something that was an issue or going on in North Carolina.
No, I completely agree. I had no idea that this was an issue. So this is a very interesting story, and people can, of course, catch up at WNCT.com. And I know that, if you watch our newscast, we'll air it then as well. But going hand in hand when it comes to talking about policy, when it comes to talking about issues that are important and to trying to push for legislative change, we talked about the General Assembly here in North Carolina on our podcast and a few bills that are happening that are currently in legislation in regards to voting and some of the voter laws and concerns that people have been having over the past year and a half, especially after the recent election. Emily, I don't know what you took away from today's podcast, but I know I was incredibly grateful for our guest and the time that he took to explain gerrymandering and redistricting and the differences between the two and how one is good and one is not so good. But of course, not so good. One is not good at all. But how these terms play a role in politics, especially today, that they do play a role today.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm interested in trying to understand what you took away, or trying to see what your favorite point or maybe something that really stood out to you was from today's conversation.
Definitely. Yeah. I thought it was really interesting. We kind of dove into, like you said, some of this legislation that's being proposed right now, not only in the Senate, but in the General Assembly here as well. And what kind of effect, if that legislation is approved, what effect that's going to have on, our next upcoming election, which is, of course, the midterm elections of 2022. And it's really all about, all these laws going out are about voter protection, voter security, voter suppression, things like that, trying to combat these issues. But, both sides are kind of playing a game, I guess is the right way to phrase it. Our guest used that phrase a few times, a game, that it's kind of just at this point almost pegging one side against the other to get those laws, support for those laws, if that makes sense. So I thought that was really interesting. Definitely you have to check out the podcast to learn more. He had, our special guest had tons and tons of information to give and tons of things to say. He, made us laugh. It was a great conversation.
He did make us laugh. That is correct. Yes. And he also had, I would call it a hack. I don't know if anyone, I'm all about life hacks, making life so much easier.
Yes.
And he was talking about there's an equation that he teaches, because he teaches public policy at North Carolina State University. He's a professor. And he was talking about how there's an equation and how it's all about cost benefit, to the voter, what ultimately whatever comes out of this piece of legislation or whatever piece of or whatever political candidate that you're pushing for, whatever they're saying, what is the cost benefit to you personally? And then you can expand it to what is cost benefit to your family, what is cost benefit to your neighborhood, your community, etc. But I liked the way that he phrased it, and I'm gonna call it a hack. He didn't call it a hack, he called it an equation. But it was quite interesting, and that's definitely, if the listener takes one thing away from today's conversation, I think that's an important tool to take away, because it teaches you how to, for me personally, it kind of puts things in perspective instead of looking at a legislative bill and being like, oh my goodness, like why is this good? Why is this bad? Right. And that's another thing we talked about was the names of the bills.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
That was a good conversation too. Yeah, we kind of talked about that. The names of these bills that our lawmakers are supporting, advocating for, authoring, that type of thing. It's almost like clickbait in a way, social media clickbait. The names of these bills draw your attention immediately, but the underlying message or what's really, unpacked in that bill might not necessarily reflect what that name is. So it's so important to, research and read into these bills, these different types of legislation that really will, impact your life in the long run, and figuring out, do I support this? Do I not support this? Again, based on your cost and benefits, which is really interesting. And one more point I want to make, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Back to the cost and benefits, our special guest, Dr. Stephen Green, was also saying, it's important for us as citizens to weigh our costs and benefits, because you also have to realize that our lawmakers are kind of doing the same thing. They're weighing their own cost and benefits for their own personal gain, for political gain, for, political agenda. They're doing that same thing. So it's important that you as a citizen, as a voter, as a well-informed citizen and voter, to really break down those costs and benefits, how it applies to your life, because they're doing that exact same thing, in the General Assembly and in Congress. So I thought that was really interesting.
That is a very good point, Emily. I'm glad that you did point that out. And I think for us, for you and I, our jobs as reporters is to make sure that we're looking at everything.
Yeah.
And we're not taking away, but we're reporting on the facts of both sides of both parties, and we're really just trying to make sure that the viewer can walk away with the sheet of those costs and benefits, and then make those decisions for themselves.
Exactly.
And I that's something that I think we're also trying to do here with this podcast, and I hope that it's teaching our viewers something, or at least that they're taking away something substantial, and we're not just wasting 30 minutes, which, I can waste 30 minutes just talking right now, but I'm not going to, because we both have deadlines and we both got things we need to do. But thank you so much, Emily, for tuning in on today's edition of Reporter's Notebook. I'm glad that I get to have you every Tuesday to talk about our podcast, because we can just talk about politics.
Yep.
And so, and to our viewers, our listeners, catch up at WNCT.com. We have a couple of episodes that have been very, very interesting lately. The UFO one was really fun.
Yeah.
Last week's was really fun. I think yours was the presidents, where we talked about the history of the presidents.
Yeah.
That was your favorite one.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah, so there's a lot of episodes out there that if you're going on a vacation and you have hours to, on a road trip, then you can catch up at WNCT.com.
Yeah.
And on Apple and Spotify. All right, everyone, I hope you have a wonderful evening.